Hello, welcome. Thank you all for coming out on this surprisingly wet last day of February. Welcome to the second lecture in the Climate Futures, Climate Justice lecture series. My name is Leah Aronowski. I'm a historian of science and a fellow here in the Society of Fellows. And with Jörg Schaefer, who I'm about to introduce in a moment, I'm one of the organizers of the Climate Futures, Climate Justice lecture series. This is a lecture series that is exploring the intersection of, on the one hand, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, carbon removal, and climate tech, and on the other hand, climate justice and equity. And it features a range of scholars who are thinking seriously about what it will actually take to achieve a justice-centered climate future. And our speaker today, Anu Khan, thinks about this every day, and we're really excited to have her here today. The lecture series is sponsored by the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, the Columbia Climate School and Lamont Doherty Earth Institute Climate Center, the Center for Science and Society, and the Decarbonization, Resilience, and Climate Justice Network at the Climate School. So the way things will go today, I'll introduce our moderator and my co-organizer, Jörg. Jörg will kindly introduce Anu, and then we'll hear from Anu. So Jörg Schaefer is a Lamont research professor and adjunct faculty member in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, a senior fellow at the Center for Climate and Life at Columbia, and a member of the governing board here at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities. He is a climate geochemist who researches how glaciers and ice sheets respond to past and contemporary warming, how changing ice and related hazards like tsunamis impact environment and society, and how science can assist in developing solutions to these climate-related challenges. Jörg is also the founder and director of the Lamont Cosmogenic Nuclide Lab, which uses cosmogenic isotope techniques to evaluate the response of ice sheets to past, present, and future warming. Most recently, he is the lead PI of the Green Drill Project, a multi-year, multi-million NSF project to drill at strategic locations in the Greenland ice sheet and apply cosmogenic nuclide techniques to bedrock beneath the Earth in order to map the response of the ice sheet to past warming periods. Here at Columbia, he's also played an integral role in getting the climate science major up and running, and he's also spearheading efforts to incorporate climate justice into climate-related curricula here at Columbia. So please, Jörg.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leah. That was about the nicest introduction I've ever had in my life. But let's go to the real event here. My pleasure to introduce quickly Anu Khan, our guest of today in the Climate Justice, Climate Futures lecture. Anu is the Deputy Director of Science and Innovation at Carbon 180. And let me quickly, for those who don't know, say a few words about Carbon 180. It's a new, they self-defined, but I think that's kind of justified, a new breed of climate NGO with the shy goal to reverse 200 years of carbon emissions. So basically, the main focus is really upscaling carbon removal solutions to scales, gigaton scales that actually matter. So by that, they are really right on the money of everything that we all hope for. I really like their kind of 5 guiding principles, so I read them quickly to you. So number 1 is climate change is unjust. Number 2, our carbon legacy must be eliminated. Number 3, reductions are imperative. Number 4, community participation is essential. And number 5, there are benefits beyond climate. So that kind of also introduces already the climate justice topic that will be central to today. Anu herself, she is her education, she holds a bachelor degree from Princeton University in physical chemistry. She has a chemistry master's from Caltech and was then working as a material science research specialist at Northwestern University, being really on the money, solid state physics and ionics and surface science and energy materials. So she then was the research advisor, or is still maybe, I don't know, and climate fund co-manager from Founders Pledge, which is a global community of entrepreneurs funding solutions of the society's most burning problems. And her recent work really focused on, at Carbon 180, focused on the topic of monitoring, reporting, and verification, MRV, which sounds a little bit technical at the beginning, but you can also translate that in a way in the one word, which is accounting, and making carbon emissions and carbon removal technologies accountable, which is really the absolute center of what we need right now. And it loops nicely into, again, also the climate justice topic. Anu just lead authored a report that came out on Carbon 180, a buyer's guide to high accountability MRV, which I found very telling. If you don't mind, we can put that into the chat, this link. It would be really nice. It's a really good read. So, and for today, or actually before today, she's kind of really becoming, with her work very quickly, a climate justice force within Carbon 180 and within the country. And we are just thrilled to have Anu here for these reasons. And the title of her talk goes in this direction, is Can MRV be a tool for justice? And we are very much looking forward to your presentation and the discussion, and thanks again for coming.
Oh my goodness, that was a very kind introduction. The short version is I used to be an electrochemist, and now I think about CDR and justice and sometimes memes on Twitter. So yeah, today I'd like to talk about MRV as a tool for justice. As Jörg said, I lead the science and innovation team at Carbon 180. And also, as he said, Carbon 180 is the first and only US federal policy NGO exclusively focused on carbon removal. So our mission is to design and champion equitable and science-based policies that bring carbon removal to gigaton scale, both quickly and responsibly. I think there's lots of folks now who are thinking a lot about the quickly piece, and so we're thinking a lot about the responsibly piece. In my role, I work with scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, and industry leaders to understand what is possible, what is currently really hard, and what is not yet possible, but possibly transformative. And taking all that into account, how do we find policy ways to support the development of a just, equitable, and high accountability CDR sector? And one thing that has been coming up, if you talk to folks in the CDR sector, scientists, entrepreneurs, investors, over the last year, is that MRV, all the accounting that tells us what happened in a carbon removal project, is going to become a very big deal very fast. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we dive in, I just want to give the quick, this is carbon removal for anyone who's watching at home who might not be as familiar. Okay, so carbon removal, it is a process that takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, captures it, and stores it for roughly hundreds of years. Sometimes the storage is inherently physically durable on geologic timescales, like rocks. And other times the storage is a result of policies and legal frameworks that protect reservoirs of carbon for long periods of time. But the end goal has to be something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and keeps it out long enough to meet our climate goals. And you've probably seen a chart like this many, many times. We're still emitting enormous amounts of carbon. We need to decarbonize extremely quickly. And even if we decarbonize extremely quickly, we still need removals in order to meet our climate goals. And I think about this in sort of three categories of why do we need removals. The first one is balancing hard to abate emissions. As we get closer and closer to net zero, there will still be some emissions left. For example, urea fertilizer rapidly decomposes to release CO2 when you apply it to fields. We're still going to use fertilizer and grow food in the future, probably. And so we will need to balance out these last remaining hard to abate emissions. And this is somewhere on the order of 1 to 3 gigatons of CO2 per year, or billions of tons of CO2. The second reason is correcting an overshoot. So you may have heard we are likely to exceed the 1.5C Paris Agreement goal. Some folks think we're going to exceed 2C. Some particularly pessimistic climate modeling friends of mine think we're going to exceed 3C. But in those scenarios, depending on what trajectory we're on, To come back down to 1.5C and correct an overshoot, we need carbon removal. I think the latest IPCC report puts that at about 6 gigatons per year between 2050 and 2100. Third reason we need carbon removal. We've already had about 1C of warming. If we get to 1.5C, we meet the goal. That is still quite bad, and there will still be about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 legacy emissions hanging out in the atmosphere causing warming. And the only way that we can address that is, again, through removals. So taken together, that is an enormous amount of carbon that needs to be removed from the atmosphere. And we're trying to scale up quickly. We're trying to do this work. But how do we know that removal actually happened and that we're reducing the harm that we claim to be reducing? This is where MRV comes in. You can use all the M's, R's, and V's that you want, whether that's measurement, monitoring, modeling, reporting, verification, validation, so on and so forth. MRV is fundamentally the set of activities that accounts for what happens in a project and enables accountability. It means buyers pay for removals that they are confident actually happened. It means communities share in the economic benefits generated. It means contractual and regulatory obligations can be assessed. Overall, MRV gives us receipts for project activities, and then we can figure out what to do with those receipts. But what is it actually? Like, what are you measuring and monitoring and reporting on? And so I like to think of MRV in sort of this cohesive framework with 3 parallel tracks. The first track is carbon accounting. It's tracking the CO2 from the atmosphere into a storage reservoir over time. And this essentially tells you about your gross removals, like how much total CO2 your project moved around. And this is, I think, often when people think of MRV for carbon removal, they're thinking about this carbon accounting piece. The second sort of track I would include is life cycle analysis or net removals. So it's the gross removals carbon accounting piece minus all of the other emissions associated with your project. And this is more sort of fundamentally what you did in terms of a carbon removal project. The third piece, and again, this is getting further away from what I think is traditionally considered the sort of MRV for CDR. The third piece is health and environmental impacts. So this is long-term site-specific monitoring of things including but not limited to air and water quality. And if you're looking at these all together, you might think that requires a ton of technical expertise and time and money. And these are very, very different skill sets. The folks doing carbon accounting and having expertise in that carbon accounting for, say, enhanced weathering or ocean alkalinity enhancement, very different from the folks with deep expertise in life cycle analysis. And again, potentially quite different from the folks who have a lot of expertise in the health and environmental impacts. And so when I share this with startups, they're often like, whoa, like this is too much. You cannot ask me and like 3 people to solve all of this. And so I want to point out that we don't think one entity does all of this, but we do think it's valuable to consider these parallel tracks as a cohesive framework for 2 main reasons. First, when you play whack-a-mole with different problems within these 3 spaces, you end up with something that looks like the voluntary market, where there's a lot of folks trying to solve problems, but when you add it up all together, you don't get a lot of meaningful climate impact. So in building a new CDR industry, we have an opportunity to think about this framework cohesively and build it from the ground up. The second reason I think it's helpful to think of these together is if I imagine someone wants to build a direct air capture facility in my neighborhood, I don't think of these pieces of information separately because one person does carbon counting and another person does LCA and another person does environmental monitoring. I want to know that if someone promises to do climate beneficial activity and they also promise not to do any harm in my community at the same time, I want that information together. And I think if we think about MRV as a tool for accountability, for communities, for public trust, we do kind of have to think about these things together. But again, it's a really big ask. And so that's where entities like Carbon 180 and the US federal government, civil society come in to pick up the pieces. Okay, that was the groundwork of MRV, of what do I mean when I say MRV? And now I want to make the link to the justice piece a little bit more explicit. And in this talk, I'm going to make 3 major claims, and we're going to kind of walk through these claims together. The first claim is that if MRV enables accountability, justice considerations are embedded in MRV, protocol design and implementation. Second, if you accept claim 1, that justice is kind of baked in there, MRV can be thought of and designed as a tool for achieving more just outcomes in the CDR sector. And then thirdly, if you take those things and you want to do MRV for justice, now is the time to start thinking about designing MRV protocols that incorporate justice principles. Okay, so what do we mean by that? So I'm going to kind of walk through these one at a time. But as you all know from my background, I am a material scientist and physical chemist by training. So I don't come from the sort of social science justice perspective. And I wanted to share a little bit of my mental model for how CDR and justice fit together. And hopefully that'll provide some insight into why I think MRV, which is, as Jörg said, kind of a boring, super technical topic, actually has enormous justice implications. And so when I think about justice at a really high level, you have this like broad set of things that fit under this category of justice considerations. And that could be types of justice like procedural, distributive, reparative, transformative. It could be intergenerational justice. It could be justice for non-human animals and ecosystems. It could be rights-based conceptions of justice, data justice. The list goes on and on. There's a lot of stuff in this bucket. But certainly in this bucket, there are 2 things that are described as environmental justice and climate justice. And again, just for folks who might not be as familiar or might listen to the recording, environmental justice is a movement that has its roots in the US civil rights movement, but really coalesced into its modern form in the early 1980s, when a community protested the siting of a hazardous waste landfill in their neighborhood in Warren County, North Carolina. And it wasn't just this local issue in Warren County. These protests triggered a number of studies that showed quantitatively what folks had always suspected, that landfills were disproportionately located in poor communities of color. And this led to folks thinking really critically, both practically and academically, about this idea of environmental justice. And this was sort of catalyzed and codified in the 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Justice Summit that produced 17 principles of environmental justice. And that kind of leads directly into the global climate justice movement that started in the 1990s and really grew in the 2000s. And the climate justice movement recognized that climate change wasn't just an environmental or ecological issue, but a human rights issue that would fundamentally alter the way people today and future generations could live. So 2 deeply intertwined topics overlapping, but slightly different lenses. And so when I think about CDR, I think CDR is fundamentally about climate justice. The only reason you would possibly do something as crazy as trying to pick carbon dioxide molecules out of the atmosphere at 400 parts per million is to prevent harm from warming. And carbon removed anywhere is essentially carbon removed everywhere. So it's a global public good. So for me, CDR fits firmly inside of this bucket. And as we mentioned earlier, one of the sort of core beliefs of Carbon 180 is that climate change is fundamentally unjust, and CDR is a tool to address this injustice. But CDR will have environmental justice implications. I heard once about an EJ leader saying, if you built direct air capture out on an island where no one lived, in the middle of the ocean, and no one was ever affected by it or interacted with it in any way whatsoever, maybe that wouldn't have EJ implications. But that's not what's going to happen. CDR projects will be built by people, for people, around people. They're going to be sited in communities. So how do you do this well at the intersection of environmental justice and climate justice? And that's something that Carbon 180 has spent quite a bit of time thinking about. We put out a report a couple of years ago and have since built on that work, where we really grappled with this question: how do you do carbon removal well at the intersection of environmental justice and climate justice? And since this really gets into a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, I want to go through this in a little bit more detail. So in our guiding principles of just carbon removal, the first one is really that the benefits of carbon removal must be equitably distributed. There's a trivial sense in which that is true because carbon removed anywhere is carbon removed everywhere, but this also needs to be true for the market for carbon removal, for the economic and social benefits that derive from these projects. Secondly, public engagement must be robust and involve input from diverse stakeholders. So for example, right now, you might be familiar with the Regional Direct Air Capture Hubs program. So it's the federal government, DOE, funding pretty large projects in direct air capture. And those projects need to think about community engagement, not just as a checklist item at the start of the project, but communities need to be involved in decision-making throughout the operational life of the hub. So it's not a one and done kind of situation. Third, safeguards are needed to ensure adverse impacts are not borne by disadvantaged communities. So it's really the crux of the environmental justice movement, right? We're not recreating the harms that led to the environmental justice movement in the first place. Fourth, socioeconomic and distributional impacts of CDR need to be evaluated alongside the techno-economic aspects. So you have to lean into the nuance. It's not a race to the bottom for just cheap tons of removal. And fifth, carbon removal should incorporate justice across spatial and temporal scales, from environmental justice to climate justice and back. So digging into these principles a little bit, how do you know that any of these things are happening, that you're acting in accordance with these principles? For example, what does a community need to know in order to engage robustly in a project over its life cycle? What data, what information needs to be shared with them? How do you know if there are adverse impacts or not? And how do you translate project level data up to global carbon impacts? You need mechanisms for accountability. And that is sort of fundamentally the link between this concept of MRV that I talked about and these justice principles. So I'm gonna read one of these out. So Principles for Thinking About CDR and Just Climate Policy is one of the first papers that came out really looking at this topic. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. There isn't a ton of CDR justice focused literature, but there's a couple of really good ones. So this first quote, some observers worry that the very corporations that contributed so much to carbon pollution could use CDR to evade accountability. But it could be that assigning these corporations responsibility to undertake or finance CDR offers a way to hold them accountable. And then you see this theme, again, in the limited literature about just CDR, of accountability to responsibility to empowerment for communities. And so that's kind of my first claim. If you want accountability for justice, you're talking about MRV at that point. So MRV enables accountability, and therefore there are justice considerations embedded in MRV protocol development. Okay, second claim. MRV can be thought of and designed as a tool for achieving more just outcomes in the CDR sector. So you take one, you're like, okay, there's a link here between accountability and justice and MRV. What do we do about it? And so what we think you could do about it is, after sort of talking to folks about MRV for a few months, we put together what we call the Principles of High Accountability MRV. And on the surface, they hopefully seem pretty straightforward, but I'm just going to walk through and add a little bit of nuance and examples. So the first principle is direct measurement of removals and impacts. As much as possible, do measurements. For some CDR pathways, you might hear that measurement is impossible and you need to do a lot of modeling. And that is true. But measurement informs those models and reduces uncertainty. They let us know with greater confidence what has happened. So you want to keep moving towards measurement that is site and context specific, even if that information is rolling up into models. And again, it's not just carbon accounting. So do I have a good model of where the carbon went? It's also the health and the environmental impacts that you want to measure directly. And all of these things roll up into better modeling. And then the second one, monitoring and traceability over time. This is important for both assessing the stability of carbon and monitoring health and ecosystem impacts. Through this lens of tracing carbon over time, you get a better understanding of what is actually happening in your system, and you can credit removals when they actually happen instead of against some baseline. Third, data transparency and accessibility. To us, this means that project data is audited by a third party and made available in some form to the public so that we can be confident that these are true removals. What is reported actually happened. I think about this in sort of two separate pieces, the transparency and the accessibility. Project level transparency rolls up into what I believe should be sector level transparency and more accurate carbon accounting. So if you remember number 5 in our justice principles, just carbon removal operates along spatial and temporal scales. This is a piece of that. do you have access to the data to allow you to think about accountability over spatial and temporal scales? An example of this might be soil carbon projects that share soil sampling data with researchers and USDA. So USDA can build a robust soil carbon monitoring network that then informs better soil modeling and deployment of future soil carbon projects. You can imagine something similar with ocean CDR projects in NOAA. So that's the transparency piece. There's also the accessibility piece of it, right? So making knowledge available to researchers and federal agencies, very different from making knowledge accessible to communities. And so we also have to think about that piece. How would someone who is living in a frontline community, working with a project developer for a direct air capture facility, how can we make information accessible in that context? And I think it doesn't have to be super complicated. I was just talking to a company that said one of the most effective things they did was just have someone designated to be the point person for the community. So often they were collecting the data that community members were asking for. They just needed to have someone who could answer that question directly. And so accessibility can be as simple as someone to talk to about the project. Okay, last but not least, appropriate incentive structure. I think we're going to dig into this a little bit more, but essentially, I think most people know that there's something weird happening in incentives in voluntary markets. For example, there are registries where you get paid for the volume of transactions you do, which incentivizes high volume of transactions, not high quality of transactions, and therefore not major climate benefits. So there's something here about incentive structures that are currently not working well and could be done better. Okay, so that's the lay of the land. That was a lot of detail that's like baked into these 4 little boxes. I want to note that a lot of these things that we're describing, if we did them like to the max, they're kind of not possible today for nascent CDR pathways. And what we're describing here, and in the more detailed version of this in the framework that we've made, is not, hey, everybody has to stop and do this immediately. The goal is kind of where do we want to be in 2050 if we have created a CDR sector that is just and equitable and highly accountable to the public? What does that look like? And that's what we're starting to describe. Because essentially, we think this has massive implications for the climate. We believe that MRV is a fundamental prerequisite in order to build trust in the CDR sector and scale carbon removal technologies. Doing MRV well, demonstrates to communities and the public that climate beneficial activities took place and carbon was removed from the atmosphere without causing any harm to communities. That trust unlocks investment of societal resources. So that's capital, energy, human resources, political will, and all of that is necessary to achieve gigaton scale. And if you're doing this MRV well over time, you're going to minimize fraud, maximize public benefit, and maintain public trust. So you have a sector that can actually last for the decades that it needs to last in order to meet all of those climate goals that I described earlier. Okay, so that was claim number 2. You can design it to be a tool for just outcomes. Third point is we have to do this now. And I think this one's, probably not super surprising. Those all the examples I had, yes. So if you are at all involved in the CDR sector, you know that there is enormous interest in MRV right now. There are private sector companies that are developing their own protocols like Charm Industrial, Climeworks, and CarbFix. You also have the private sector independently attempting to do third-party verification without really standardized frameworks for the whole industry. And you're seeing large entities from other industries come in and try to become verifiers for carbon removal. You're seeing investors and buyers who are really sort of shouting from the rooftops about the importance of good MRV because what they're trying to do doesn't really make sense in the absence of good MRV. So you have things like Frontier Fund and Lower Carbon talking about MRV. And that's just on the private side. On the public sector side, you're also seeing a ton of interest in MRV for carbon removal. DOE recently released a call to national labs asking them to help figure out best practices for MRV. In things like the Farm Bill, there's a lot of interest in doing better MRV for soil carbon and forestry practices. The Regional Direct Air Capture Hubs program that I mentioned before There's a lot of interest there about best practices for life cycle accounting. So you know kind of net removals that you're getting from any federally funded project of that type. I could go on. There's a lot. There's a lot of activity in the public sector and MRV as well. And that's when you start to get nonprofits and academic centers that are trying to navigate the space and fill in the gaps. Stuff like Carbon Plan doing a lot of really good work on uncertainty levels. Carbon Gap, which is a policy NGO in Europe thinking about the European certification framework, which is super important because it unlocks investment from the world's largest compliance market at $760 billion. You're also starting to see nonprofits that are working specifically in MRV, and of course, Carbon 180 working in this space as well. So all of that to say, this is happening now. So if you want want to be in striking distance of doing MRV better in a way that is more accountable, the time to do it is now. Okay. So what do you actually do? The point that I would like to make here is there's a lot of scope to do things in this space, maybe too much. And I'm just going to point to a few things that we're currently working on, but there's many, many more things that we could be doing. So first and foremost, community engagement on MRV. As some of you know very well, Carbon 180 recently did a report with XPRIZE to help startups think about EJ and community engagement. And we also have a regranting program where we work directly with environmental justice organizations to help them think about CDR. So I think this high accountability MRV piece, there's something here about community engagement. And specifically, I have this hypothesis that MRV can be a tangible way to build connections between startups and communities because you're actually providing something. You're providing data about what is happening in someone's community. And one of the first things we'd like to do to explore this hypothesis is develop pathway-specific community toolkits for understanding and working with project developers. So if someone comes into your community and wants to do a CDR project, federally or privately funded, what are the questions you ask? What is the type of monitoring that can be done? What is the timeline for this monitoring? There's all sorts of nuance built into there, and we can help communities better understand and engage with that conversation. There's a whole bunch of other things that need to be done on community engagement as well, so I don't want to undersell that at all. Second, capacity building. MRV protocols will be highly technical and require specific scientific expertise to design and implement. But who is doing the designing and the implementation? And are the designers representative of the communities where these protocols will be used? And if they're not, what do you do about that? I think that's very much a question that we need to ask. And there are a few things that we can start doing in this space, like technical assistance funding, EPA, USDA through Ag Extension Officers. There are models for this, but there's definitely more that can be done here. And then, of course, there's the really big picture question of what are the pathways from communities that host projects to spaces where protocols are developed, like universities and research facilities and Silicon Valley startups. The next one, I promised we'd come back to this one, incentive design. Pretty much everyone recognizes that something went very wrong with incentive design in the voluntary markets, where it became a race to the bottom for chief offsets. But there are folks who are starting to develop better principles for MRV incentive design in the durable carbon removal market, buyers like Shopify, suppliers. So one of the first things that we want to do is really get folks together and surface what are the biggest problems that we see in MRV incentive design and who is best placed to address those problems. And then lastly, Carbon 180 is a US federal policy organization, so there's definitely work that needs to be done on policy implementation. One of our flagship policy campaigns right now is around federal procurement of carbon removal. So can the government support this market in the early stages by directly purchasing carbon removal? And that requires us to do really high quality standard setting. Procurement makes no sense whatsoever unless you have high standards for what you are purchasing. And that is one of the most important things that the government could potentially add to the field at this scale. And so those are some things we could do. I think there's a lot more that could be done, and I would love to hear from you all what you think could be done in this space. Yeah, that's all for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And inspiring talk. So we are supposed to sit down here and invite questions from the audience. Very much.
I have to speak
So
in mic.
first question, yes, for you.
Yeah.
Oh, gotcha. Hi. First of all, thank you very much. And I have a question that is around like MRV outside of like CDR, but when it kind of overlaps with this. So for example, right now I'm working with a group that's trying to raise kind of public awareness and engagement with the US Army Corps project for New York City to build like a seawall, the HATS project. And one thing that we run into is that despite their claims for justice and like, having a very environmental justice focus, is that certain things that they're using, for example, cost benefit analysis for communities and like the cost of certain things are based on things that are fundamentally unjust. So, and like based on redlining and property values and the fact that we even have like sacrifice zones and environmental justice communities in the first place. How would MRV and CDR in this case, like, how would it like directly combat that? Because that's something that would need to be, I'm sorry, like it can't be based off of that.
I think, oh, right. Yeah, I really, really appreciate that question. And I think one would want to note that I myself am pretty new to this space, and so came from it from the technical side of CDR, and am learning about the types of considerations that you just described and how they play out in CDR specifically. I think this probably will not be a very satisfying answer, but I think a lot about case studies for the types of projects that have happened in the past and are currently happening, and ways in which those projects failed to meet the needs of communities and failed to address environmental justice considerations, and what can be learned for CDR from that. But it's going to be hard because CDR is happening in a world that has a lot of these major environmental justice issues. I think folks are looking at different ways of approaching this. One interesting one that I've seen and I'm excited to learn more about is it different if you have a public ownership model for a carbon removal project and the project itself and its development is driven by the community? How does that upend some of the dynamics that you've described for what might otherwise be a top-down large infrastructure project?
A sheet and then Ben.
Thanks. I'm on now? Yeah, okay. So the last point that you made was almost exactly the question I was going to ask. So my question is sort of slightly two-pronged here. One is to do with the community engagement and the other is to do the incentive structure. And I guess there's a wee bit of a skeptical, cynical me that basically seems to see incentive structures where everybody's checking off boxes because everybody gains from checking off boxes. What I mean by that is that you get an ad saying plant a tree, you're happy to give the money to plant a tree may be planted, we do not know if it'll live 10 years, but in the meantime, CDR has happened by somebody's accounting, and that's clearly not good enough. And I'm just sort of curious about those incentive structures you're trying to put there. And to me, it seems that maybe the model you just last talked about, which is some sort of a public enterprise that handles that, might be a path. Then that's a curious thing that I want to hear more about. The second part is community engagement, because that seems to be a very key part of what it is we're talking about, which is that we're engaging with the communities and co-producing the project with them from the beginning. And so also curious to hear your thoughts on that, because it seems that it's almost always a checkbox in the beginning and then forgotten afterwards. And so I'm curious to know what you think of as how you would maybe not legislate, but sort of make sure the track is followed, if that makes sense.
Softball question. So to make sure I captured your questions, there's a large question about how do you enforce best practices so you at the beginning of the project you set up some framework for how you want to do this in a just way. How do you make sure that happens? I think that is a fantastic question, and one that we don't have an answer to, but has come up quite a bit in our conversations with folks who are working in the justice space. So this work came out of a long series of interviews with justice advocates and with our own team that is working directly with environmental justice groups. And one thing that was raised repeatedly is, sure, I buy that MRV can be a tool for justice and accountability, but that is not enough. Right? The MRV is not the justice part itself. It enables responsibility and enforcement. And I think we are just starting to have conversations about what is that next thing? What is the enforcement mechanism? What is the form of legal liability that ties into this? And I think you're starting to see that also with the work that DOE is doing with Justice 40 and having requirements for community benefits plans and project labor agreements in their grant awarding process. So there's definitely an awareness that enforcement it's just not there. It's potentially a weak link, and some efforts to start making that more concrete. But I think there's a lot more work to do there. You had another question? I don't know if I addressed it.
We'll follow up afterwards.
So a couple things strike me, both partly because of this first question and partly from what you said. First of all, environmental justice is inherently heterogeneity. And what I think of when I think of climate is inherently, one of the reasons we've moved the needle on anything atmospheric or climate related in terms of policy is that in fact, it really affects everybody. And I think this really relates to incentivization that Ajit was bringing up. I think the key here is, in many ways, to think about making policies that actually benefit directly the people who are disproportionately affected, rather than policies that benefit everybody. Because they just aren't the same thing. If we have a flooding system here, flooding problem in New York, it inherently involves not everybody, and inherently, it affects everybody if some part of the city disappears. But we need to think about incentivizing certain kinds of behaviors in those areas by benefiting those people. I mean, that's part of the community engagement part. And similarly in climate, not everybody cares if it gets warmer, right? In the same way. And we need to think about incentivizing certain kinds of benefits based on those disproportionate effects as well. And so I think part of the answer here in accountability and how to go forward in doing things is really to benefit specific parties that actually are directly involved in solving the problem rather than just benefiting everybody. And so, for example, a small stakeholder farmer who is, modifying how they farm in order to store soil carbon, right? They should benefit directly, not just have somebody who's down the value chain take all that benefit or carbon accounting or whatever associated with monitoring and really use something. So I think that's something to think about there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the thing that I would add to that is we are trying to, as we include in one of our guiding principles of carbon removal, the benefits need to be shared with communities that are impacted. The other thing that I would add is there needs to be appropriate risk mitigation as well. If you're doing work that is necessarily highly site specific and context specific, yes, you can, farmers can get $7 per acre or whatever for carbon farming, but there also needs to be appropriate risk mitigation in place for a farmer to take on the risk of trying something new. So not just the benefit side, but the sort of flip side of that coin.
One aside related to farming specifically, I think actually farmers directly benefiting from carbon storage is actually a risk mitigation, because most of farming's benefit is along in the future, and especially if you think about long-term sustainability, whereas an immediate benefit from carbon sequestration is you might get credits from that immediately. So it's actually a great risk mitigation.
So I'm an atmospheric chemist. I spend my time measuring CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. And I kind of had a question for what you mean by CDR, because I'm hearing it from all sides. And I really, in my head, I'm struggling to pull apart how we would even monitor it properly for a lot of things. So I spend my time thinking about measurements. So if we're developing things that, for most of the things I can think of, environmental justice isn't the first thing that comes to my head. Reducing carbon emissions, now that's an environmental justice side of things, because everything that's a combustion source, there's NOx, there's you producing ozone. So everything that's reducing carbon emissions, I can see that as key environmental justice. You can clean up a neighborhood in no time. But from the CDR side, I don't fully understand what the environmental justice component of that is. You know, if you're planting more trees, is it there's more isoprene, you need to be careful what species you're planting, you know, that kind of thing. So what do you mean in detail by CDR? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a weird question. No, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that goes back to kind of these like overlapping climate justice and environmental justice, where CDR redresses the harms of warming, like that's the only way you can do that. And so it lives firmly in that climate justice is unjust, or climate change is unjust category. And I think the intersection with environmental justice is in the context site-specific place, where, for example, the regional direct air capture hubs program is targeted towards fossil fuel communities. So it's funding that's directed to place this new technology in a community that potentially was harmed by past extractive industries. And so then you start getting pulled in. There are a lot of ways, but one specific example in which you would see that intersection between CDR and environmental justice would be something like that. But I think generally it's because the deployments are always place-based. They're always within a community, and that community has concerns and needs that need to be taken into account when building out a project.
Is that direct capture of like plume emissions, or like what do you mean by that? I guess I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah, so I would say it's less about redress of a specific environmental harm as understanding the context in which this new technology is being placed and the history of that community and potential harms.
What's the technology? I haven't heard of like plant trees as a process, but not, you know, what are they actually planning to do in that network you were mentioning?
Oh, so regional direct air
basic.
capture hubs. Yeah, well, the technology is it's direct air capture hubs. So it's direct air capture. It is a chemical means of removing carbon from the atmosphere. It's essentially a box with a fan that blows air into it. It absorbs CO2. The CO2 is released and put into permanent storage.
Any pollutants that could be emitted in that process? I guess that's kind of where I would think first is.
So I think that is an open question because these technologies are still very nascent, low TRL, pilot projects. No one's ever really done it at scale. I think right now, if you talk to folks in the space, they would say, probably not. Like, we know a lot about amine sorbents, but we've never done this at scale. So I think that's where the high accountability principles come in. Like, you have to monitor it over time. Like, no one's used this sorbent at this scale in this way. So let's make sure that it isn't getting into the air or the water. And if it is, that it's at some threshold that is understood and safe. And then you get into a lot of other questions. But yeah, I think it's... Yes, sorry, I didn't understand your question initially.
Explain further.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the end of life of CDR. I think there's a couple different scenarios for that. I'm not super knowledgeable in this field, but I'm wondering if 2050, 2060, 2070, we meet our goals and we are in restored ecological atmospheric balance where there's some type of obsolete value to CDR, or at least maybe a lesser value than the urgency it poses now. I don't know if that's true. This isn't my field, but in that scenario, or in a scenario where the technology itself meets end of life. How do you think about that in terms of environmental justice? If the technology becomes somewhat obsolete to the community and they're no longer finding direct benefit from it, you know, how are you thinking about that in terms of environmental justice?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think most folks in the space right now are thinking a lot about how there's no carbon, like durable carbon removal, and there should be some. And so not really thinking about that end of life cycle yet. But I think it's a really great question. The first thing that came to mind immediately was like a circular carbon economy. So there's a lot of stuff like wood products that are made out of carbon, and currently we use fossil fuels to make many of those products. And is there a way where once you're sort of past the max removal that you need, you're able to transition some of that capacity or are continuously transitioning some of that capacity into a circular carbon economy, and just thinking about a different way of building and using materials.
I think so. I wanted to ask you about the DAC hubs that are coming, and the fact that 2 of the 4 DAC hubs are intended for oil and gas communities, right? And I think that's such an interesting clause in the law, because I hear that and I think, oh, that's exciting. Maybe that's thinking about a just transition. But I think an oil and gas community hears that and they might think, you're saddling us with yet another like monstrosity that like who knows what the effects will be, like these are already EJ communities and now you're going to put something else in our community, right? So how do you handle that when you're talking about community engagement? And I also want to talk a little bit about the benefit side of CDR and what that looks like for community. From my tiny research on this stuff, I know that when you talk to CDR companies about benefits, they say it's job creation, right? Like we're going to bring jobs. It's going to be jobs, jobs, jobs. But but obviously that is a very different understanding of justice than what a community might actually think of when they hear justice. So how are you managing that at the community conversation level? And if I can add also, like, where does the MRV fit in that sort of schema too?
Those questions. So to the first question of communities might perceive that fossil fuel piece differently, I think you ask how they perceive it and then kind of go from there. In terms of what benefits means, and is it just jobs the whole way down, and how does that relate with MRV? One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is MRV will be its own workforce, I think, like auditing, certification, physical site visits, developing the protocols, doing the testing. I think I've talked to some folks who are more in the chemical oceanography space, and they're saying like, there's like a handful of grad students who can do these measurements for ocean CDR right now. And like, you just can't take that many measurements. So I think, yes, when people talk about jobs right now, they're mostly talking about like, if you build a DAC facility, how many people will full-time be employed inside that facility? And that number might not be that high. There's a few estimates. There's that Rhodium report that's a few years old. There's a more recent report from this iWest Mountain Energy Transition Group that's quite good, and that's from 2022 or this year. But I think it's also really interesting to ask, how many people do you need to do this level of high accountability monitoring, reporting, and verification for a gigaton-scale carbon removal industry? What kind of jobs are those, and how are they embedded in communities? Everything's MRV all the way down. You try hard enough.
So if you're dealing with that kind of magnitude, what's the best way to start measuring that in the atmosphere? Like that's what I spend my time thinking about that. So it's a very biased question. But if we're talking about capturing that much CO2 for all of these plants, surely we should be able to see that on massive scales and be able to evaluate that. Are there plans for that, or in the atmosphere? Yeah. You should be able to see a massive CO2 hole around them. Well, I mean, is there any plan for that, I guess? There could be, but I just don't know of anyone who's in my kind of bubble. Like, people are much more concentrating on like flying spectrometers to look at methane plumes. That's a whole big thing at the moment. Carbon mappers trying to do a bunch of stuff. Satellites looking at plume detection, but none of them, the hyperspectral satellites, they can't see uptake. Not really. They don't have the resolution to look at things that are below the atmospheric background. So they can look at enhancements above. They can see power plants, they can see massive methane plumes, but there isn't even a plan for the depletion part of that. Should there be? Yeah. Sorry.
So in the conversations I've been involved in, which are quite limited, that is a part of the CDR process. So it is local, as in it is locally, it is specific to any particular project. So it's not looking at it at a global scale, but they do have to account for the, well, should it be? Maybe, but if it is going to be difficult to detect, at least you should be able to report for it at the project level. And unfortunately, even that sometimes is sort of not quite there because they're not doing things, they're not thinking about things like life cycle analysis. You know, very basic things. I mean, you remember the workshop in Rhode Island where we're talking about marine carbon dioxide removal, and life cycle analysis was not really a part of that conversation. Maybe it's because it's the beginning stages and it'll catch up. You know, I am fairly certain it'll catch up, but you know, many of these are fairly nascent in the discussions. But I think thinking that we will see it at a global scale in the very near future, I don't see that. I personally don't see that.
Thanks. Want to add to that discussion? Or I have a question here too. So before we go here, Lamont internal, I have a completely, is that okay if I have a total, but it will derail the discussion, so it's completely different. So I have one basic question for you as a scientist, which is naive almost, but how does this in practicality work in the moment? If you have, I don't know, I'll come back to my Greenland example. So do you have a company taking cobalt and nickel out of Greenland at huge environmental costs, but simultaneously electrifying a certain amount of the energy market and can certainly prove that there is a huge benefit in terms of carbon removal? So how do you, what's the formula to evaluate that? So if you have kind of a project like that to evaluate, or if X price has to evaluate that, how is this even done in terms of a quantification? And then I have another question personally for you. But yeah.
I think that is a really, really hard problem. And I think in my framework of like carbon accounting, life cycle analysis, environmental impacts, it sort of fits in a little bit in the life cycle analysis piece of what went into your facility and into the environmental impacts piece. So I think it's a very specialized area of research. I think there are folks who are looking at this challenge, and it shows up in carbon removal in some specific ways. So for example, folks talk a lot about the energy needs of carbon removal. The energy needs of carbon removal, where you potentially scale up something like direct air capture at the same time that you're trying to decarbonize the grid. And so what is the appropriate trade-off there of putting new energy, renewable energy capacity or low carbon energy capacity into direct air capture versus into the grid? And that's not a solved problem at all. I think it's a question that is now being surfaced and can be potentially addressed through a life cycle analysis type of framework.
So what are the think tanks thinking about that?
They're thinking someone should think about it.
Okay. Okay. Yes, there is a question from some.
RMI might be thinking about it.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Lisa Phillips with the Columbia Climate School. Well, I have a question actually about the gaps that you see in the knowledge and how a school like Columbia University and the vast researchers that we have here, as well as the partnerships that we can help engender between organizations like yourself, like Carbon 180,
where do you see a role for us here in the academic sector to potentially partner with you or help further your goals around the data that's needed around the MRV and the policy outcomes you're hoping to achieve?
In every way, I think every piece of this work has embedded in it very interesting and potentially thorny research questions. So for example, financial incentive design for MRV, there are different economic analyses that you could do related to that. There are case studies from other industries and the incentive structures in those industries that can inform how we think about carbon removal. So for example, how renewable energy credits are priced, and that is in EPA's greenhouse gas framework, right? So there's all of these different pieces that I think a lot of folks have expertise in, but maybe we're not connecting the carbon removal folks to the folks who have expertise in this much broader range. And as the industry matures, we can't just sort of be like, well, we're new and we're just figuring it out. Like there's gonna be so much more that we can learn from other industries. And I see institutions like this and other academic institutions as being a great resource for that connectivity.
So partly in response to Jörg's question, I have an injustice, or I'll call it an injustice, that I think is important to realize, and that is that if we take something simple, like the simplest example about, he brought up cobalt, but if we bring up lead, which is the most common battery material, the fact that we're increasingly depending upon lead acid batteries has, really direct repercussions across injustice in the globe right now. We have more people now with lead poisoning than we've ever had in history, despite the fact that if I write a proposal related to lead in the US, I'm told that it's a solved environmental problem because we already removed it from gas, right? But yet there are 1 billion people on Earth and 10% of New York with measurable deficits from lead exposure. 10% of New York City, by the way, more than Flint, although we talk about Flint. I mean, it's a meaningful thing. And I point that out because I think that as we switch towards a carbon-free economy, we're really talking about major shifts, major increases in resource use, and major injustices associated with industries that we didn't think of as having anything to do with carbon. And it's easy to talk about something as primary, I'll call it simple, as how a carbon reduction plant removing CO2 from the atmosphere in some neighborhood affects that neighborhood, but it's entirely more significant and affects much more people to think about the downstream industries associated with that decarbonization.
Yeah, I mean, that's one spectrum of it's kind of side effects of CDR is kind of a huge topic. Yeah.
In general.
Yeah, I was wondering, what do you think are the limitations or the possibilities of MRV to make sure that companies aren't going to use decarbonization as an excuse to just emit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So Carbon 180 has the position that we don't think carbon removal should be used to offset ongoing emissions at all. Our focus is legacy emissions. It's all the stuff that's already in the atmosphere, that's already causing. We can't undo the irreversible harms, but we can limit additional harm in the future. So that's kind of first and foremost our position, that the entire function of carbon removal should be legacy emissions. And that's how we think about appropriate incentive structures. That's how we think about growing the carbon removal industry. That's how we think about the market. And it speaks to why we think federal government procurement of carbon removal is going to be really important, because if you're using it as an offset, you can get people to pay for it because it allows them to do something that they want to do. But if you're using it purely as a public good to eliminate legacy emissions from the atmosphere, that's really the role of government, to provide public goods.
Once the infrastructure is built, how I guess I'm wondering about timescale now. Like, how much carbon? Like, how long would that take for it to remove all that legacy carbon? Like, what amount is that legacy carbon? Right.
Forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, it's like 1,000 gigatons, right? Like a trillion. Yeah, it's an enormous amount. I personally have a hard time imagining, like, in 2070, when we have a gigaton scale carbon removal sector, and we've corrected the overshoot, and we can start even thinking about legacy emissions. I have a really hard time imagining what the world looks like then, what other technologies we have, what other problems we have. But I think in these early days, setting norms that are around accountability and justice and legacy emissions, that's the piece that we can do now. We can be really clear about why we're doing this and what we hope to accomplish, and set the stage for what it could look like in 2050.
How are we in time? Okay. So then I can maybe ask my kind of convoluted, slightly personal question. So I think the question is about if you really want to make a difference, and I mean, you come from the academic, technical, scientific sector, and you switched over into the NGO sector. So what is your experience in terms of effectiveness of your work in both sides of in both worlds? And the background to this question is that I'm increasingly worried about the super tanker slowliness of big academic institutions like the ones I'm part of, and see simultaneously with all, I mean, you get all these questions asked, how do we actually do this? How do we get this to the ground? And of course, you cannot have all the answers. But given that Carbon 180 was founded in 2015, the progress is amazing and it's fast. And if you keep on that track, then you have already an impact, but there's no such thing in academia. So that's why my personal evaluation where this question comes from, but it would be great to hear from you if you see any kind of uptick in satisfaction in terms of making a real impact.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I think in terms of where's their impact, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how I can use my career to have an outsized, as big an impact as I can. And I think there's so many things that need to be done that there's no shortage of ways to be impactful. And I think spaces like this are great to surface problems that someone could then get really excited about and say, like, oh, like someone with a really strong background in atmospheric modeling needs to work on MRV to ensure that it is deployed in a way that it is just. And so there's so much that needs to be done, and that's why I come to places like this and talk about it.
That's very, very kind of you, but I was not asking for a therapy. I mean, I need, but it's more really like, how was this change, this transfer between the scientific world to where you are now for you? What was the biggest difference in your work routine? And so,
I talk to a lot more people now. Yeah. That's literally the biggest difference from being in the lab and really being in the work and running tests over like 24, 72 hours, the test stand going, to work that is a little bit more collaborative, requires more coalition building, more compromise in some ways, but generally more listening and engaging and trying to bring people along on this journey that we need carbon removal. I mean, we're in this space, we're talking about something that's really in the weeds of like, can you detect, removal from space? And most people are at the level of what is carbon removal and is it actually carbon capture? And like, do you do it on a natural gas plant? And the answer is no. And so I think that piece, just like the communication piece and stepping out of what is really interesting scientific technical detail and like, no, people do not know what is happening here. And we really need to focus on the communications.
Thank you.
Having a scientific background help for a lot of those discussions.
I hope so.
Question in the back.
So it's a curiosity, so including everybody. So imagine that I have a portal that everyone, I consider that everyone here is completely aware of the problem of the carbon brings to the humankind. And so if there is a portal that each of you could self-assess your carbon footprint, and there is a Verra gold standard project certified by Verra gold standard related to this portal, would you intend to offset your carbon footprint? And this, it's a curiosity that I have, because I don't know, it's none of a public that's very, very aware of this problem. This awareness is so big or not?
Was the question if we would offset our individual carbon footprints? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think
It's like $10 per month, $12 per month. This is the American average cost to offset.
yeah. Yeah, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is like, I don't think that offsetting is actually possible because those offsets don't exist. The credit markets are not sufficiently reliable that you could do that even if you tried, even at fairly great expense today. So that would be my answer, is that that's not possible right now. And maybe in a world where it is possible, it raises different questions, but yeah, that's my...
With some blockchain in a verified project, it's possible. Yeah, it's completely possible.
As long as you're the first one.
It's possible to offset your individual emissions today.
I have a huge project, and I can offset many different individuals. There are many small and medium business as well.
Yeah, I would have a lot of questions about the MRV associated with that.
I mean, it's another, it's a topic. I'm German, and in Germany there's this kind of, and I'm living abroad. So to see family, I have to fly across the Atlantic. I'm constantly facing that carbon offset problem. And I think there are that's why I really like this approach, that you're not talking about CDR to offset actual emissions, but you're kind of really thinking about that as a legacy issue, because I think this kind of, Germany is a good natural laboratory. What can go wrong if this individual, are you carbon neutral as a person, can go really off? I mean, it's kind of, there are the weirdest developments in German society, because they're basically, there's a significant part of the society asking directly, am I greener than you? And it's really, it comes, and that's not a healthy way to feel this discussion. So
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the example of recycling, right? Where it was turned into something that was deeply individual, but chemical manufacturing is a society level problem.
Yeah, and it, I mean, immediately leads to, I am better than you, because All right, are there more questions? If not, then thank you very much again. The discussion was really also inspiring, and thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And thanks again for coming, and looking forward to talk more over the evening. Thank you.